Sounds good. So, I guess continuing on the growth mindset workshop, I'll be talking a bit more, I guess, of a neuroscience connection, because I'm really interested in neuroscience, and so talking about how, I guess, the brain kind of relates to growth mindfulness, and the growth mindset. So, I just wanted to start off by saying the brain is like a muscle. Your brain, obviously, your brain isn't actually a muscle; it's made of fat, but it acts like a muscle in the way that your brain can get stronger, like when people embrace challenges, right? And so, and then talking about our growth mindset too, the other part of this of my presentation, which is it's important to have a positive growth mindset. As Dr. Knuckles was mentioning, I can get smarter. Learning is my goal. Effort makes me stronger. I spend more time and work to get smarter and to make my brain in a way get stronger. So that's what we'll be talking about here, and strategies and ways to actually improve like neural connections in that way. And so just a little bit a quick agenda. I'll talk about the growth mindset and brain connection, how our brains can get smarter, um, and brain cells, neurons, and neural pathways, brain plasticity, types of brain plasticity, and what does our brain need to get smarter, along with a few tips that could be really helpful for the brain. And so before I get started, just a little bit about me. I'm a senior living in Silicon Valley. I've been researching in various areas and fields of neuroscience for the last 4 years. In my free time, I love to play basketball, and I'm really interested in the adolescent brain or the teenage brain, right? Like as we're all teenagers, and I founded Our Teen Brains, which kind of talks about the neural changes that go on um, during adolescence. But diving into the growth mindset, as Dr. Menkel was mentioning, the growth mindset and there's the fixed mindset, right? And it's kind of a spectrum. There's not really like one or the other. But a mindset is kind of associated with neurons and neural pathways, right? So for the growth mindset, like I could try a different strategy. Is this really my best work? This can take some time and effort. But the fixed mindset, right? I can't really do this necessarily. This work is good enough. It's too hard. And so there's it's kind of the spectrum, and we want to talk with a growth mindset. We want to have a growth mindset rather than like the fixed mindset. And so can it can a brain get smarter, right? And oh, that's a really interesting question, Rohan. Is it possible to have a fixed mindset about your mindset? I feel like, I mean, in a way, sometimes people feel like I can't improve, I can't think anymore. And I do think, in a way, sometimes people do have a fixed mindset about, I guess, your mindset, which is really confusing to think about at first. But yes, I mean, I do believe it's possible to fix mindset. I don't know if there's a definitive answer to that, but I do feel like if you can, for example, someone can think, oh, I can't really change the way I think, right? I don't want to. This work is too hard, and someone tells them, come on, you're motivated, you can do this. But if someone thinks that, oh, yeah, I just can't do it. I just can't overcome this obstacle. It may be possible to have a fixed mindset about the mindset, which is an interesting way of thinking about it. But that's actually a really great question. But we'll go to like the next slide now. So can our brain get smarter, right? And I'm pretty sure a lot of people are familiar that the answer to that is probably yes, right? When we practice and learn new things, part of our brains change and they get larger, just like muscle. So through, I guess, conscious active action, right, the brain becomes stronger and smarter, and it could study. Scientists started thinking that the human brain could actually develop and change, and that happened when they studied animals' brains. And so, how did that happen, right? And really quickly before I show one of the case studies, um, let's look at actually let's go directly into the a case study of the rat here. So this rat, there's two rats, right? So scientists started thinking the human brain could develop and change. When they looked at the study, they found that animals who lived in a challenging environment with other animals and toys were different from animals who lived alone in bare cages, right? So while the animals who lived alone just ate and slept all the time, the ones who lived with different toys and other animals were always active. They spent a lot of time figuring out how to use the toys, and how to get along with the other animals. And so through closer neural examination, they found that these animals have more connections between nerve cells and their brains, inside their brains, I mean. And so the connections were bigger and stronger too. Actually, in fact, their whole brain is about 10% heavier than the animals playing without toys, without any source of neural enrichment. And so the adult animals who exercise their brains by playing with these toys and with each other were also smarter. They were better at solving problems and learning new things. They could kind of navigate their cages better, solve most of the time, I guess the rest like about going through the maze that they kind of place and similar stuff. So those animals who are in an enriching environment, their brains are more I guess were ready to kind of fight to combat these challenges, to think more critically in a way. And so they studied animals and then they generalized this to humans. And so the question is, can adults grow their brains too? Because we'll get into plasticity in a second, but most of the time neural changes occur during younger ages, right? And so what about adults? And so adults can actually grow part of their brains that control abilities as well. For example, adults can grow that change their ability to do math or juggle. In one study, scientists found like a group of adults who weren't jugglers. They taught half how to practice juggling in the right way, and they practiced for a long time and got much better. The other half also were learned how to juggle, but they didn't really do any practice, and they didn't get any better. And so the scientists used a brain scanner to compare the brains of the two groups of people, and they found that people who learned how to juggle and actually practiced grew parts of their brain that controlled juggling skills, the visual and motor areas. Their brains changed, so they actually had more ability, and this is surprising because people said before that they couldn't juggle, were eventually able to juggle. So this shows that even the adult brain can change with experiences and enrichment of neural connection. And so another study, right, about the London taxi drivers. So those London taxi drivers, you may not know, they kind of have the whole map of London memorized. They know where every road is, every intersection, about like as specific as you can get about where everything is located in London. So they actually have a larger hippocampus. Now the hippocampus is the region for memory, and so that region of their brain is much larger and more developed because well they need to memorize a lot more, right? They need to memorize the roads, the intersections, where everything is, and so that kind of shows more proof that the brain is kind of malleable, it can change, and even for adults, the brain can grow depending on circumstances. And so now we talk to the taxi drivers. Let's talk a little bit about brain cells. So um, the neuron, right? So the neuron's, I guess, the fundamental part of the nervous system. It kind of transmits neural signals, neural nerve impulses, and so inside the outer layer of the brain, which like the cerebral cortex, there are billions of tiny nerve cells called neurons. I mean, to be accurate, it's around 86 billion neurons, which is a lot of neurons, right? And that's only in the brain. And so, the neuron has like three parts. You can see the cell body right there in the center. And let me the pointer, that might be easier. Is anyone able to see the green pointer? That's a bit strange. No worries, but I guess if you see like where this arrow is in the center where the soma, the word soma is pointing to, that's the cell body. Yeah, I think I'll just explain it then. So the line soma is pointing to the cell body of the neuron. There's the dendrites, or like branch-like extensions, which kind of receive the neural signals, and then they get it towards the cell body. And the axon goes away from the cell body, and they kind of transmit the signals throughout the neuron to the next neuron. And so nerve cells are branches connected into other cells in a complicated network. The axon terminals, which is like there we go, the axon terminal of one neuron, which is like the end of the neuron, kind of connects with the dendrites of the next neuron, right, to transmit signals from one neuron to the next, sending information. That's how they're like kind of connected in a neural pathway or a neural branch. And so as I want to mention, the average adult brain contains 86 billion neurons, almost as many stars as there are in the Milky Way galaxy. So the number of neurons in your brain is almost as many stars if you look in the skies and see, almost almost the same amount, which is really crazy to think about, like when you think about it for a second. Um, but going back to neurons and neural pathways, right? So a neural pathway is a connection that allows a signal to be sent from one region of the nervous system to another. So neurons are connected, signals go from one neuron to the next, to the next, to the next, across the entire pathway, right? And neurons travel the neural pathway throughout the entire brain. And so this picture is like, I guess, kind of a stained image of, obviously magnified as well, of how neurons kind of connected and they form these entire pathways which kind of connect to transmit signals and information from the body to the brain for interpretation. Um, there we go. So we talked a bit about neurons and we talked about neural pathways in the brain. So how can a brain get smarter, right? And so communication between brain cells is what allows us to think and solve problems. So when we learn new things, tiny connections in the brain actually multiply and get stronger. And so in between two neurons, as you can see right here, in the presynaptic, in the magnified portion, there's a presynaptic terminal, the synapse, and the postsynaptic, right? That's a synapse. There's around 7,500 synapses in adulthood brain. And so the space between neurons and the synapses is kind of how signals transfer from one neuron to another, and where memory is kind of stored, where information is stored. So when we learn new things, these tiny connections, these synapses between different neurons multiply. There's more enhanced connectivity in certain pathways, right? And that causes like it kind of grows, they get solidified, reinforced. And so when we learn more things, the synapses get reinforced, and we're able to store more. There we go. Yeah, and we're able to store more information in the synapses because as one grows, more of these connections start to form between different neurons in the neural pathway. So when we actually learn things, there's reinforcement of these connections, leading to increased memory and the brain getting smarter. And so synaptic pruning, right? And so obviously this is a bit of a dense slide, so there's no need to go through everything. But what happens is that the first 2 years of a child are a time of rapid brain growth, right? So at birth, there's an estimated 2,500 synapses with every neuron in the cerebral cortex. Now, by the time we're 3 years old, at 15,000 already, right? And we remember, as we mentioned, that there's around 7,000 synapses per neuron in the adult brain. So what happens is synaptic pruning, right? So as we gain new experiences, some connections are strengthened and others are eliminated. So for example, let's say I learned to play the piano at age 3. So I practiced for age 3 and 4, and my piano pathway is really solidified. But then after that, I'm like, okay, maybe I'll try playing the violin instead. And so I played the violin for 5, 6 years, and I was considered it's my violin pathway that's reinforced, strengthened, right? And so those synapses form. But as I hadn't played the piano in so long, slowly by slowly, um, my brain starts to see, hey, this pathway isn't being used at all. Why do I have it? Why don't I remove that pathway, remodel it to form a different pathway for like playing the violin? And so in that way, um, they kind of, those that pathway gets diminished, degenerates, and it kind of switches to a different neural pathway. And so some of these events that we don't really use, that we don't reinforce, they get lost, and others that we use more, for example, like for me it would be the violin, that gets used much more. Rohan, so when the synapses are counted, do they count the synapses on a neuron's dendrite and an axon? So it's a bit of a, I guess, a confusing terminology question, right? So the synapse is actually the space between a dendrite and an axon. So the entire pair between the one dendrite and the one axon, that space is a synapse. So if you have axon terminal of the old neuron, then the synapse, then the space, then the dendrite. That whole thing counts as like one synapse basically. Um, and so as people grow, right, eventually there's too many synapses in the brain. Those start to cut down, and which is why behaviors that aren't really practiced or used during adolescence or like young childhood years tend to go away before adulthood. And so that's synaptic pruning. But now we go to neuroplasticity, and so neuroplasticity is always one of like the more fun things to talk about because it's really really cool if you think about it. So neuroplasticity or brain plasticity is the ability of the brain to modify its connections or to rewire itself, right? Um, it allows you to form new memories. It allows certain actions to be learned. There's plasticity in the hippocampus. It enables the brain to make new memories of events, right, throughout a one's lifetime. If our brain wasn't able to change or move at all, how could we make new memories, right? If nothing changes, my memories would be the same from when they are at birth, which just wouldn't work, wouldn't make sense. The entorhinal cortex is a region of the hippocampus that has a lot of plasticity, but that's getting a bit technical. Plasticity in the cerebellum as well helps coordinate new habits and movements. You learn how to ride a bike, right? You weren't born learning how to ride a bike, but through practice and by learning it, you were able to, I guess, gain familiarity, and now you don't need to think when you're riding a bike. And so if our brain never really changed, how would we ever have learned how to ride the bike, right? So plasticity in the cerebellum helps coordinate these movements, and that's what happens as well. Plasticity is ongoing throughout life and involves brain cells other than neurons, including glia and vascular cells. But a lot of times, it's these neurons which send signals that are especially important in plasticity. And a great way to summarize it is right here. So let's look at this chart actually. So the synaptic activation, right? An activity occurs, synaptic activation. So now there's two things that can happen, right? So if it's a weak activation, it's that it's nothing that happens too much, just happens once in a while, and it's nothing that really impacts one's brain. It doesn't really change any synapses. But if there's strong and frequent activation, it'll change the synaptic structure. For example, switching from piano circuits to violin circuits. The connection strengthens, and that leads to multiple things. For example, seminar style training is not enough, right? Because you need reinforcement. Just hearing someone tell me how to play the violin, that won't really work. I need to practice, constantly practice, reinforce that circuit. Someone can just tell me, okay, you put your finger right down here and your third finger here. I mean, in theory, that's awesome, and I haven't ever practiced it. How will I ever, like, gain practice? Even for the juggling, right? Those who never juggled, they never really gained exposure or practice to it. So reinforcement is needed for learning, and that way, that activates the synapses, and eventually the neural circuit is solidified. And now, someone who's been playing the violin for like 7, 8 years won't even really need to think. It just comes as second nature to them, and so that's kind of how brain plasticity works. And so just to really quickly summarize everything on plasticity, whoops, there we go. The bottom line is that the nervous system controls our body through communication through neural pathways, Based on our goals, desires, and habits, the brain tries to modify these pathways. For example, pathways involved in memory can be improved and extended through multiple repetitions. We train our brain daily to create a new pathway and repeat actions until it's defined in the brain as a new pathway, and these pathways become part of our brain. And so, according to research, it takes 21 days to make or break a habit. This habit formation is depending on training our brain to create new neural pathways. Complex like behaviors like driving a car is an example of neural pathways formed. So if you guys are getting your license, 21 days of practice will be a solid amount for your neural circuits to develop. That doesn't mean you're done driving, doesn't mean you've learned everything, but at least it'll give you some familiarity. Same thing with riding a bike and a lot of behaviors. Sometimes for riding a bike, I know it doesn't even take 21 days sometimes, but around 21 days is like the average according to research. And so we can skip over this really quickly, but I guess there's just two types of plasticity. There's structural plasticity, which is experience of memories or memories changing of brain's physical structure, and functional plasticity, where brain function moves from one area to another area. Oftentimes it's damaged area to another undamaged area. And just a really cool side note, there was actually once a patient who had to get half her brain removed to surgery because there's two hemispheres, one hemisphere is completely removed. But she was perfectly normal because of neuroplasticity. The other half of the brain also started to take over the functions that the removed half of the brain was working. So half the brain was doing the function of two halves, and that person was able to live a normal life. So brain plasticity is really, really really cool in terms of functional plasticity and even structural plasticity. With even half a brain, the person was able to basically live a normal life, which is incredible to think about, really. Um, but that doesn't mean plasticity is always good, right? Good brain changes are often seen as improvements, but this isn't always the case. In some cases, for example, the brain can be influenced by psychoactive substances or pathological conditions that can lead to detrimental effects on the brain and behavior. Drugs or alcohol tend to be some of these substances. If you do something that's good for you, the circuitry will fire faster, stronger, and more clearly. Now, let's say someone doesn't really want to think anymore. They spend a lot of time, I guess, on their phone, just lying around, watching TV, eating popcorn, and always sounds fun when we're thinking about it. But it'll happen to their brains, right? None of the neural circuits aren't being activated. There's no critical thinking going on, and so in that way, those circuits will start to degenerate a bit more, leading to laziness, and sometimes it'll be harder for the individual to think. So plasticity can be helpful, but if it's not really utilized properly, it definitely has some negative possibilities. So we want to keep our brain sharp. We want to keep our brain smart. So what can we do, right? And I mean, we all go to OHS, so all our minds are constantly challenged, which is always a great first step. But another thing is that if we understand that the brain can get smarter, then we have a growth mindset. If we understand that we're able to improve, we're able to learn all the time, that's a great way to start off the growth mindset. We can do better in school because we have an empowering perspective on learning. We'll see it's going to really teach us a lot. It's going to be help us be better people. We'll focus on improvement and see an effort as a way to build our abilities, and we see a failure as a natural part of the learning process. Sometimes you may not get a grade that you want, which happens to everybody, right? But like going through the feedback on the essay that might not have been as good, and looking through that kind of reinforces um, the growth mindset, allowing one to understand, okay, my brain can get smarter, I can learn more, I can do better, I can think more critically. That kind of helps us as students as well. And so I want to share, I guess, some 6 tips that I learned through research and through friends. And I guess the first one is to think positive, right? Sometimes you can be your worst enemy, and that can be the hardest obstacle to overcome, right? If you believe that your mind's ability won't change and its capacity is static, it's just going to be hard to improve. So it's critical to think that we can learn, we can develop and evolve with time and effort, because understanding that and believing that will help motivate your mind. And that's one thing I believe is really important. Just being confident in yourself, being positive, always really helps. Another part is to read. There we go. It's to read, right? And it shouldn't be surprising, but many people underestimate just how reading can influence and improve the mind. People who read aren't just articulate, they have a vast pool of knowledge and an always evolving mind. Reading improves vocabulary, expands communication skills, develops analytical skills. It doesn't even need to stick to certain books or dry scientific novels either. Lord of the Rings also works, Pride and Prejudice. All of those books can help improve mind and impart life lessons. And for everyone who loves reading, this should be something like would become like second nature, like, oh, I love to read, right? So that's always great. Reading can be really fun, and so that's also something I really suggest. Another thing is rest, and I know we're OHS students. Sometimes we're up to 11:59 submitting that one essay, which is due Friday night. But staying up all the time isn't really as helpful either, right? So sleep helps your brain process new information, making it easier to remember. Give your brain a rest. sleep 8 hours a night at your best to be your best, right? I know it's going to be hard for us high schoolers, but optimally, for ever able to get rest, sleeping 8 hours is always the perfect amount. The lack of sleep, relaxation, and excessive stress can diminish brain's capacity. The brain requires plenty of energy to function, so if you're exhausted all the time, your brain simply won't have the ability to improve and learn more. Then we have eat brain food. Now, by brain food, I mean like healthy food, right? So there's brain busters, there's brain boosters. Fuel is fuel for the body, but it does matter what kind of fuel you're using, right? High nutrition foods work well to power up your brain. Walnuts are a great source of brain food, so is fish, tuna, mackerel, salmon containing rich fatty acids that have been proven to help neurons function. And of course, make sure that studies hit intake of omega-3 fatty acids, your brain will be really thankful for that. And Sophie, that's right. If you sleep like sometimes in the morning, I tend to work much faster and much better after I sleep, right? Because that definitely works much better for me. When I'm tired at night, I sometimes get lazy. I can't really think what I'm doing. But in the morning, I always work much better. Um, yeah, I think Dr. Knuckles will answer that question when in just a minute, Carla, when we switch presentations. I think you would be better suited to answer that. I'll just really quickly finish up my last couple of tips, which are to challenge your brain. Get into mind cardio, right? Remember the brain is like a muscle, so thinking, playing brain games, right? Memory games are always fun. Chess is fun. Your brain needs to face challenges to make progress. We go to OHS, so of course we also get some brain challenge, which is great. Um, but using full potential and pushing your limits. Try brain games like memory games, Sudoku, word puzzles, problem solving, escape rooms too. Those are really fun and they're a great way to challenge your brain to keep pushing itself. And finally, a great idea is to keep a journal. So what do Einstein, Isaac Newton, and Thomas Jefferson have in common besides they're like really great um, I guess they expanded so many fields in philosophy, science, but they all kept diaries. Taking notes, writing down things or ideas, is creating an extension of your mind. Your thoughts will be recorded, and the routine of writing them down will enable you to think more thoroughly and improve ways of writing. And so, I guess to summarize my presentation, growth mindset and smart brains, right? Don't be afraid of a challenge. Understand that you can train my brain to do anything, and if you can't do it yet, with effort you can. I can, right? Have that I can mentality, and my mistakes will help me grow. And so with that, that kind of concludes my presentation. Thank you so much, everyone, for listening. Thank you so much, Dr. Knuckles and Dr. Steele, for having me. And now we'll kind of segue back to Dr. Knuckles' presentation as he can explain more about mindfulness and growth. So thank you, everyone.